Hello, I'm Alex Totaro.
And I'm Alex Goldstein.
We're a couple of TV nerds with opinions, and this is the thing that gets you to the thing, a Halt and Catch Fire fan podcast.
This week we're on season 1, episode 6, called Landfall, which means we're learning that personality really does go a long way.
If you've listened before, you'll know we're going episode by episode, rewatching this show on Amazon Prime in the UK. Right now, it's also on Netflix in the US and Foxtel in Australia. So wherever you are, we hope you can find it. It's more than worth the effort.
Okay then, let's take shelter from the storm. So guys, before we continue on, we have a little confession to make because I think the show is beginning to rub off on us as podcast people. This isn't our first episode 6. We recorded an episode 6. We had it in the can. We had it edited. And when I say we, in case you don't know, Alex T is actually the the technical. He's the Gordon, the Donna, the Cameron. He's the everything behind this. My voice gets to be the Joe. So Alex had it all edited.
Yeah, I'm the one always lowering my own voice.
And the thing is this, obviously, at the time of recording, there is a pandemic raging. We are not recording in the same room. And if it's hard to get sounding good in one living room, it's really hard to get it sounding not just good, but the same in 2 living rooms. And so it just didn't sound brilliant. There was a little bit too much echo. There was a little bit too much sort of fuzziness to it. So now that we've worked some stuff out, we got some advice from our friend Matt, who's been incredibly helpful, from a couple of other podcasters, Caroline at Sentimental Garbage, Dave at Let's Make a Horror Movie. And we think we've fixed it.
I've got Nikki to thank for all the pillows surrounding this microphone as well, which is apparently a little tip I received from podcasters and people doing a lot of online classes.
Surround yourself with duvets and pillows to sort of soak up sound. And we think we've pretty much fixed it. We think we pretty much nailed it. So we said we're going to do episode 6 again. And we just wanted you to know that because we feel like this is the Gordon Cameron dynamic, isn't it? It's like Gordon is sort of always teetering on, but we've done it. It's okay. It works-ish. And Cameron just wanting to take it up a level. Joe needing it to look and sound really, really good. And maybe Donna needing to explain how we got here. So there you go.
Yes.
Just so you know, we're living the Halt and Catch Fire life as well as talking about it.
Exactly. So thanks, guys, for sticking around. And we really just wanted to make a quality product as best as we can, considering the context of everything that Alex G just explained. So we hope that this makes it a little bit more bearable for all of you guys. And yeah, looking forward to re-talking about episode 6, which is an episode that we both seem to like. Finally, we both sort of agree on an episode that wasn't 100% perfect, but just really started to dive into Gordon's headspace, which we hadn't seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like after a few experimental flourishes in sort of between episodes 3 and 5 that we're having a bit more of a kind of momentum building now, that it's starting to find its feet again as an episode. We've had another change in the writer's room. Well, I'm sure all these people were in the writer's room all the time, but another change of lead writer and director. So the key writing credit this time goes to Zach Whedon. And if his name sounds familiar, it's because he's Joss's brother and Jed's brother and Tom's son and John's grandson, because script writing, screenwriting is it's the Whedon family business.
What a legacy.
So he's come in. He'll go on to write another 3 episodes across this season and the next. And he cut his writing teeth, because he does other things as well, but he cut his writing teeth on things like Deadwood and Fringe and Southland. Really interesting is our new director. So that's Larissa Kondracki. She's a Canadian writer, producer, director. Another woman in the seat, which is great. Her background is a mixture of features and TV, but what's quite interesting is that a lot of it is quite dark. So her breakout short film, which is called Vico, and her first feature, The Whistleblower, both cover themes of abuse, of sex trafficking, some really quite sort of dark and depressing themes. And before Halt Catch Fire, she'd sort of done some TV work in things like Graceland and Covert Affairs. But since then, she's gone on to The Americans, to Better Call Saul, to The Walking Dead. So it feels like there's a sort of gritty darkness that runs through her work. And as we look at this episode and some of the themes in it, I think it's quite an interesting choice.
For sure. And I kind of like that we're going back to, in terms of writers, someone that is coming from that TV landscape, sort of purely TV. I'm sure he's done some other stuff, but the reason I say this is because I feel like the show really picks up the best of both worlds when it comes to the pacing of a television series, with the flair and the cinematic of obviously film, on top of something like soundtrack and score, which is kind of overlooked a lot of times, depending on the TV show that you go for, or it's kind of plagued by more commercial music led pieces, which, elevate a scene and really enhance the narrative, but not quite like what the showrunners have accomplished here with *Halt and Catch Fire*. And we'll see that obviously going into season 2 and beyond. So it is interesting to hear this background, because the episode does feel dark in loads of points of views, and definitely when we hit the eye of the hurricane. Now, one of the things that I told you when we were first doing this recording was that I do really enjoy a hurricane episode, because to me, it is the one sort of natural disaster that doesn't need previous sort of explanation, other than there's a natural disaster that's going to rip through town. It can be absolutely destructive, or it could pass by, and it just forces characters to be in the same room for an amount of time that allows them to sort of open up a little bit and kind of give them some respite from everything else going on around them. In this case, unlikely pairs. So obviously we've got Joe and Donna as the, I guess, centerpiece from that point of view of the episode, while Gordon is just trying to run around like crazy trying to find the Cabbage Patch Kid.
Absolutely. And it's not a bottle episode, because obviously it takes place in a number of locations, but it has some of the hallmarks of that, in that it locks people in certain areas, either isolates them as it does with Gordon, or locks them together with Joe and Donna. And one of the fun things about hurricane in particular, and that's probably the only time anyone will say there's a fun thing about a hurricane, but as a narrative trope, it carries a little bit of film history with it. So we're used to the idea that something sweeps into town and changes people. Since the 30s, we've seen, everyone's seen The Wizard of Oz, and you see this kind of transformative storm. It's a tornado in that instance, come in, and the world literally changes color. And when Dorothy comes back from her experiences, sort of locked out of one world, and comes back into the world that she knows, she's a different person. And so you see this hurricane approaching, and already your mind is primed to think, who's going to have that experience? Who's going to come out the other end having experienced a sort of Technicolor world for the first time? And that was a fascinating thing to watch unfold, because I think there were some things I found predictable in a good way. Sort of,
Sure.
Oh yes, that would happen. That's the character development. That's what would happen to that character. And some things I didn't see coming.
So did you think that the episode moved things along a little bit more than the previous episodes have?
Yes, because here we've got two things going on here. There's a couple of personal revelations, I think. We know more about Gordon by the end of this episode than I think we did before. And we get to see a slightly different facet of Joe than we have in the past. But also we have this fundamental question now. We have this fundamental technology question. Up until now, the technology question's been mostly, can they do it? And the it has just been, oh, we want something that's faster and lighter than anything that's come before. So we want to sort of just move the dial a little bit, just shift it a little bit along from where we already are. We're now coming to a fork in the road about what your vision of technology is, because we're talking about sort of effectively this thing that's come up before, the soul of the machine, right? You're talking about whether technology needs to have a personality, whether you need to interact with it as and feel like you're interacting with something sentient.
Yeah.
And you get this divide between Cameron's philosophy, which is that, I'm not sure if she says it. Someone in the episode says authenticity is what inspires people. I can't remember who said it now.
She said this. There was a big parallel in this episode between the machine and the human, and Cameron being the connector that sort of brings this out in a way that really relates back to her childhood, right? And why she got into coding in the first place. And it's got its funny moments when she, for example, tells Joe, like, oh, how human like, because she keeps telling him that he's a robot, right? She keeps telling him that he turns off his emotions depending on the context, right? It's like when you're at work, you are my boss and you're very stern, yet we see them in a very intimate setting when they're sort of having that wake up moment. And I do apologize. I did mention this in the previous episode, thinking that it was this one, because these two episodes, episodes 5 and 6, to us really felt like one almost. Like the similarities are actually quite astonishing when you put them side by side, considering that the arcs are a bit different when it comes to the technology side. However, on the human relationships and the narrative side, they do have a lot of parallels and a lot of similarities. But going back to what you were saying about Cameron giving the computer a soul, we're seeing a little preview as to what we know the future becomes when it comes to the user interface, right? And how we engage and interact with these machines. And this really is Cameron's bread and butter. This is what she was alluding to when in that pilot. She wasn't able to articulate in 2 words because she didn't even know what that was back then. And I think having her step up in episode 5 and taking on this role where she's really built a solid foundation with a team that she can rely on to then have the headspace to think about these things and try and move things forward.
Absolutely. And we've said before that the show is really good about how it places things in time and space. It tries not to hammer you over the head with 80s references. And to some extent, necessity is the mother of invention. I think the reason that some of the music choices, for example, are a little bit more offbeat is because initially there probably wasn't the budget to go for the really big needle drops. And actually it worked in the show's favor, right? What you don't get is lots of, really heavy-handed references. You get little things. This episode probably has one of the clearest sort of time markers with the Cabbage Patch Kid phase, but it's not important what the toy is. It's just important that Gordon has to go on this journey to go and get it. But what it does do is use a little bit of our foreknowledge to kind of root us at a particular point in tech history, because we know that the Macintosh is around the corner. We know that when that comes out, it's going to be the first computer to have that sort of interface. We know that it's going to have a graphical user interface, that it's going to have that way of sort of talking to you and communicating with you like a little friendly robot. And we know ultimately that in our timeline, Cameron's vision is the one that's going to start to dominate the tech world. And so when she sort of, programs it to say, hello world, we know that there's going to be a really similar greeting from Apple. And we know that Apple exists in their timeline
Yes.
too. We know that this isn't a different 80s. It's a thing that could have been happening in 1983. So we know that Steve Jobs is in the picture because he gets mentioned. We know that Bill Gates gets mentioned in another episode.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be as realistic as possible, and it's not possible that someone with their finger on the pulse as much as Cameron wouldn't know that some of these things are happening. So it sort of grounds us in the early 80s by using what we know is coming. And I think that's just really elegantly done.
I love that element of the show because the technology element is something that really pulls me into the narrative. I love technology, but I do love that they actually use it to further the narrative when it comes to the connection between the characters. Because really, what this brings out is this Gordon approach, which is I'm done, I finished it, I can't give you that RAM, I'm exhausted, it works, don't touch it, we got to get it out there. And she's not wrong in the way that she is thinking. I think we've seen it already in terms of what Joe wants it to be and what's at stake here. And, you got to put out something with that differentiator. And fast forward into 2020 consumer products and electronics, that is the only thing that will sell. Brand loyalty is sort of dipping. But all these brands, whether that's true or not, all these brands have been built on these kind of uh, niches that they find themselves in. Macs and Apple being the graphical user interface, right? Windows computers for the reliable utility software, if you want to call it that. So I do think that this brings up an important point. I'm kind of glad they're bringing it early on, because I think sometimes we get a little bit stuck into what that technology they're building is or isn't. Like, is it just a portable computer? Is it something that is cheaper? I mean, he wants to get it out. Joe wants to get out into the market sooner, but we don't really understand really why they want to compete with IBM. Only that Joe comes from IBM and that's it, right? If you really think about it, so they really are putting themselves out there, um, and really questioning what is this computer. And that sort of speech that Cameron gave Joe around what you were mentioning earlier, that her father gave her this teddy bear, and we know that her father died in the war. So this carries a lot of emotional, I guess, baggage for Cameron, and she carries it around and she gives him the speech. Joe probably has never. He doesn't understand because he's probably never had that upbringing. He's never had someone emotionally connect with him as a parent and give him this kind of thing. So his reaction was actually really fun to watch, because it wasn't judgmental, and it wasn't questioning Cameron's upbringing, or even why she would carry that around. And actually, a lot of times we're quite harsh on her for being very childish and immature. And I think the writers are having a little bit of fun here in telling us that she actually carries around a teddy bear in her purse or whatever. So I do really like those nudges towards them, but I do think that maybe versus previous episodes, these are the ones that start pitting the characters against each other's in just fundamental ways of thinking, which is essentially what the show really will excel at in future seasons, I think, without giving anything away, of course.
This episode is so much about identity, right? The identity of the machine and the identity of the people in it. So we have lots and lots of people seeing themselves in new ways, new camera angles, which we'll come to in a second, reflections, lots of those things, and people kind of rediscovering things about themselves, and through their reaction to the technology, through their reaction to the hurricane, through their reaction to each other. And it feels like in tandem with that, the showrunners, the writers, the directors are also beginning to know these characters better as well. So you have Cameron, yeah, she can absolutely throw her toys out the pram and it's really frustrating, but she is getting this level of self-awareness now. She's beginning to kind of connect things in her mind. And I don't know whether that's just because, they've been writing her for a few episodes now and they're beginning to connect things in their minds. But she's beginning to weaponize her personality a little bit in the right kind of ways. She's beginning to realize that she can do the big dramatic stuff and get away with it, but she's saving it. She's not having big tantrums at Joe for the sake of it. She's making impassioned pleas for what she believes in. But actually, the only really tantrumy gesture that she makes is when she embarrasses Gordon. And it's a really powerful statement because she's not the one that comes out of it looking like a pathetic child.
Yeah.
He tries to use her sexuality, he tries to use her personal life against her, and she flips it on him very, very publicly, and really couldn't have found a better way to make him look small. Like, she doesn't sacrifice any of herself because she doesn't care what other people think about her that much. Certainly not the random people in the Cardiff office anyway. And so it's almost like, as she's beginning to kind of peel through this revelation about the machine, she also has these revelations about herself. And interestingly, so I think we get this angle for the first time, and I think it was you that originally pointed this out to me, is the camera now sits inside the screen looking at her.
Yes.
I think we've had her reflection in the computer screen a few times now, but I don't think we've ever seen her from the computer's perspective. And going all the way from Gordon's dream of this sort of natural thing growing in the machine, all the way through to now the machine has a perspective on Cameron. They're really not missing any opportunity to subtly remind us that the machine is now a character in this, and they're battling over the personality, the soul, the is it going to be an empty plastic box, or is it going to be something that actually people interact with and that has a slight personality, life, character of its own?
That's a really interesting point, because we don't actually see the machine in its entirety throughout the entire episode. When the episode begins and Joe has everyone in the boardroom giving, basically revealing the computer, we actually see the camera pan behind the computer and sort of tilt upwards as Joe is going to unveil this big thing. Now, any other show, any other film would have, you know, given us that big magician moment where the rabbit comes out of the hat, right? But this episode is all about the inside of these things. And quite rightly so, as you mentioned, getting into Gordon's head, getting into the soul of the computer. So I love that they've done this, because they actually do it a couple of times in very subtle ways. And I mentioned this to you when we were last recording. There's also a very subtle shot where Donna and Gordon are talking in their kitchen, and it's their usual kitchen shot of the countertop and the camera sort of behind the furniture to provide these layers. But this time, we can actually see a light bulb, and that light bulb sort of exposes the device, right? In something like film and TV, any production that involves lighting, showing a lighting source is actually one of the hardest things that you can do, because a lot of that is actually manipulated outside of that environment, right? It'll be like, here's a light that looks like a nightstand lamp. But here we're seeing it, which actually gives us that aha light bulb moment in a subtle way, which is also fun. But going back to your point about those reflections, I think it's great that the show doesn't even bother showing us the entire machine in a close up or anything like that. That's the only way we've ever seen parts of this, right? It's always been like, here's the motherboard plugged into a speed test machine. Here it is, literally thrown in a fish tank. Here is Donna mapping out the schematics of what that blueprint will be. So I love that they've done this, because they keep reminding us that, to your point, it's just another character in the building. It's not something that's finalized. It doesn't have a name yet. It doesn't have that soul yet. We don't know if this gamble is going to pay off. I love that they flipped the camera around when Joe saw that sort of hello world message at the end of the episode, because everything up until then wasn't just a reflection, but it was always a reflection on Cameron, because that was her doing rather than anything else. And that's why Gordon always tends to be the one sort of tinkering with sort of chips and, and circuits, to the point where some foreshadowing in the first few scenes where he literally gets shocked back into being awake from that weird dream. So I think this is, if the show can do more conceptual elements like they've done in this episode, I think it's going to become really interesting, because it gives us an in to the character without it being cheesy or over the head, and really just gives us something to ponder over. Like, does that flower mean that there's something growing that will be malignant, or will it grow into something that will blossom into a success? Because Gordon can't reach it, right? He's struggling with it. Is that flower representative of Cameron's ideas and he just can't get there? Or is there something more to that? And we'll unpack that scene as well. Again, it's the first time we've seen a scene like this. And for me, alongside the Joe Donna dynamics, was probably the best of the episode.
That's so true. It is the first time that we've seen anything like a dream sequence. We've seen lots of waking up sequences. We've seen lots of kind of morning routines and things like that, but we've never seen anyone dream something quite surreal and then come into the world that way. And I do think, like you say, I think it's an absolutely fascinating choice to make that happen now, when they're having this massive existential philosophical question over what a machine even is. Is it a living creature, right? Is it actually spawning something in someone else's head? And to go back to the quote in the very first episode that gave us the name for this podcast, If the computer is the thing that gets you to the thing, is that what that flower is? Is that the thing that it's getting you to, your own blossoming? Or you're right, is it a weed? Is it weeds growing in Gordon's head that he just can't seem to shift? There are so many possibilities, and I feel like it could be both at the same time.
Yeah, it definitely could be because it's always a double-edged sword, isn't it? Whenever you get something out there in the market that you've spent so much time developing, and it is something that Gordon has experience in, as we know, the symphonic. Is this going to be history repeating? We don't know what happened there. So it's very difficult to understand whether a lot of these sort of dreamlike sequences, including the actual dream, are alluding to that. Now you can tell that the director had a lot of fun in creating that scene because it really allowed them to just play around with different camera angles and techniques. So, we're sort of seeing this tilt shift lens just focusing on the flower, making everything else look sort of miniature. Watching it back to back, it's really interesting and it's hard to explain on just audio, but the reaction of Gordon trying to reach for it and that constant shot of the flower and Gordon and the flower and the Gordon, it's almost very traditional in a setup sense, but it's just great to watch because you really feel the struggle. And then when he gets jolted back to life, essentially, Gordon's reaction is very Gordon. It's kind of this sort of goofy, like, oh, what even was that? And you're right, the reflection on the glasses and a lot of the tinkering that he's doing. I think alongside the fact that the episodes that I continue to love are the ones that are filmed entirely in dark spaces or at night, just because they're able to play with these elements. If you're in a dark room and you have a spark, it really, really helps stand out a lot more. So I think that's what's been really interesting about getting these directors and this talent behind the camera that really understands when to bring those aesthetics into a show like this one. This is not a horror show. This is not a scary show or a thriller by any stretch of the imagination. And it's not about it being that. It's about certain scenes creating that tension to allow us uh to feel some of that drama, right? To just feel like something is happening.
I mean, a lot of what you could call thriller or horror or tension in the show is happening in people's heads. And of course, that's notoriously difficult to, when people say the lazy thing that I hate, which is, oh, the book is better than the film. I love reading. I just think that's often nonsense. I think what they're saying is the internal monologue is clearer in a book. Yes, of course it is. It's written down.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
if somebody knows what they're doing, you can play with visuals to create that in a different way. And Kondraki, in many ways, has a really lovely episode on her hand because it's all about mental darkness and mental clarity. And then she gets a hurricane to play with to show that to the world. And that ranges all the, and she gets such a lot of lovely visual moments in this, and it runs through the production design and it runs through the costume choices and all those kinds of things, because it goes all the way from the very, very obvious, so Joe and the billboard and the tie, and he sort of takes off a red tie, interestingly, because red isn't a very
Yes.
common color on Joe. It tends to be Cameron's color, and she tends to wear it when she's making a breakthrough or when she wants to make an impact on a scene. So he loses it, she gains it, because we're seeing a shift from his view to hers. She is now becoming the dominant force in how this machine is perceived. Gordon stays in his sort of, he dresses in the colors of hospital corridors. It's so he stays in this
Filing
sort of,
cabinet, yellow
he
folders.
stays in this sort of awful beige and brown throughout, and he's being sidelined. He's being relegated to the inside of the machine and not the bit that people actually communicate with.
Yeah.
And so she goes from those kinds of shots, which, okay, I think, even somebody who had never thought about filmmaking or TV making before in their entire life would get that Joe's reflection and the billboard, that's not subtle. All the way through to that sort of devastatingly weird and creepy scene where, and we'll kind of get into the hurricane details in a second, but where Gordon sort of staggers through the rainstorm to see that someone's been electrocuted. And even someone who for a second I thought was him, but actually just kind of looks a bit like him.
Me too.
Yeah, and is sort of lying in this wasteland that looks like a movie set. Like it doesn't look like a normal town anymore.
It looks like a Western sort of set, but actually, a
Yeah.
little fun fact that I found out earlier this week is that the show filmed in Atlanta, Georgia, and it shared filming locations with The Walking Dead, which is
Ha.
another very popular AMC show, as everyone here knows. The reason they did this was to share resources, both in talent behind the camera, but also locations and anything that would help them lower costs. And potentially why we see a lot of the Walking Dead talent sort of come onto the show, which is such a cool and interesting mix, I think, right? When watching this episode and reading that, I was like, right,
Yeah.
this makes sense.
Do you know, I've never wanted to watch The Walking Dead, but now I kind of do. Is it too late?
I want to see like Carrie Bechet running in the background or telling Joe off maybe and behind one of the scenes, like the Starbucks cups in
Little
Game
wisp.
of Thrones episodes.
Oh my God, those were amazing. But I mean, this is the episode in which we have someone say out loud, I think it's Cameron, of Gordon, he's traumatized from being a loser his entire life.
Yeah.
And then we
Yeah.
see Gordon undergo an actual trauma just after having fallen for a scam in a really obvious, like a really obvious scam.
Gordon. And
And
the
then
camera
having-
gave that one away as well. I love that.
Yeah.
I had to rewind and see if it was a single take, and it was just the last bit that was. But the way the guy runs off in the car and you see Gordon sort of like, finally, I saved the day. But then it's like, you just picked up a
That
wrapped
horrible-
box with rocks and you didn't think to look
that
twice.
horrible realization. That, like, when it dawns on him.
But then he actually throws the rock through the window in the other shop, doesn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. So he uses he sort of reclaims what he's been scammed by to then do this
Yeah.
criminal, destructive thing. And then has this.
Which is very Joe-like, by the way.
It is actually. I mean, it was one of the moments of genuine support when I was talking about some things like Cameron owning her destiny a little bit more, I felt was in the best possible sense, a predictable kind of character development. It felt natural. It
was earned.
It was
earned. It was leading up to that, yeah.
We've really come a long way from toddlery toys out the pram Cameron in the early episodes. Like she's really finding her feet. I expect Gordon to do self-destructive things at this point. I have not yet really seen him do a sort of fully outwardly destructive thing. So watching him lob a rock through a window to steal something, to kind of get a little bit of power back after having been sidelined and scammed, and knowing that he says early on, I think, Gordon Clark to the rescue, and we all think, the minute you say something like that, he's going to screw this up, because we've got a pattern. Even in just 6 episodes, we've developed a pattern of Gordon overreaching and under kind of achieving.
And only doing that in certain moments, like him getting into bed with Donna really late and trying to almost find the weakest moments to try and bring himself up. It's not a case of, hold on, I know what the girls want. I know what Jody likes. I'm going to get her this. And then I'd be like, good idea. That's quite popular at the time. It's like Donna always has her finger on the pulse, even though she's spinning 1,000 plates. And Gordon just comes in to, I don't know, to sweep in when he wants to. And clearly Gordon's loser streak, as you called it, continues to be his defining characteristic, but also what's been driving him. But I do think there's a sense of like, I need any small win I can take, because that's the only thing that keeps, I don't know, pushing him down, I guess.
I mean, Gordon's almost kind of a depiction of the stereotypical, I should say, fun dad who doesn't want to be part of the day-to-day, or in his case, isn't maybe capable of being part of the day-to-day, but they want to sweep in and have the big gestures and get the big birthday presents and have, the fun moments and the big moments and be remembered for being a really great dad. And, I don't think it's cynical. I think he does love his family. I just think he has absolutely no idea how to get out of his own head. And we've had that really amply demonstrated by the fact that, while other people are interacting, sort of Donna with the girls, Cameron and Joe with each other, he is dreaming about the machine and the things that he can't reach. Like he is this episode, which, does so much to drag Donna and Joe and Cameron out of themselves, just forces Gordon further into himself. And right at the end, actually, when he kind of strolls in and obliviously kind of goes, "Have we had dinner yet?"
Yeah, that's what I was gonna mention. Yeah, it's like, where have you been, mate? Like, what time even is it? You're so out of it. I mean,
Like he's glazed, he's soaked, he's carrying this doll that's unwrapped. he's
he's disconnected. And, maybe that was that jolt of lightning in the beginning and him sort of coming around full circle. Because we know the show likes to do this, right? We've seen it with the dead bird, that the show really likes to sort of come back to sort of that beginning point in a way that is different than when it started.
When you combine Gordon's mental state with all these reflections in the show, with all these actual physical reflections and people seen through glasses and things like that, the whole impact that you get actually is of somebody in a dissociative state, right? You get the impact of someone watching themselves.
Yes.
And when he sees the guy on the ground, and we both had this reaction that we were like, is he seeing himself? Is that person even really there?
Yeah, because the lighting was also so dark that
Yeah.
maybe I think they did leave it a bit up to your imagination as to whether he would have. I would have thought that his first glance at the person would be him, and then the second glance would be like, oh no, that's another person.
Yeah, and I sort of felt like we got a bit of that, but it was still a little bit ambiguous. With the lighting being it is, of course, when you've got a lot of water, you can play with reflections even more, and everything just seems a little bit warped, a little bit hard to touch. Like it becomes
Slippery, yeah.
yeah, it becomes more slippery, more intangible, harder to hold on to. And it's sort of to shift a little bit to Joe and Donna, if we can, the difference in the baptisms that Gordon and Joe receive. So they both go out into the storm, they both go out into the water, they are both changed by it. But in Gordon's case, it locks something down. And in Joe's case, it sets something free. So, he goes out there. He's loosened himself up a bit. He's loosened the button at the top of his shirt a little bit. But by the end of that hurricane, he's rolled in the mud, covered in leaves,
Yeah.
everything yeah.
Let's talk about Joe infiltrating the Gordon household. Those scenes were a joy to watch. You have a sort of, yeah, you're right, button down Joe sort of coming in to this dinner after some very rough episodes with Gordon, where we don't know if that's a genuine friendship, because this is crossing a line, and I don't mean crossing a line in a negative way. I mean crossing a line into getting to know someone's family, getting going into their home, etc. But they were in a really bad place last episode, which obviously it's mentioned by Gordon and why he wants to do this. But when he comes in and the kids are jumping all over the place, and he's like, don't touch my shoes, or they come from Italy, like, here are my fancy things that you people do not understand, to then building a sheet fort with pillows, a pillow fort. It was great to see, because Joe would never have done that with anyone else. I think the kids here really played into allowing that space, because if it was just Joe and Donna in the awkward dinner setting, it probably would have been more intense. I think it would have brought out a side of Donna that was more stern and maybe critical of what's been going on. Of course, I think she's kind of lost in her own head with everything going on in her work, to not really see what is going on with Gordon. If there's anything that we should be worried about with Gordon, I don't think she's seeing much of it, because she's not seeing much of him.
No, but you can imagine a dinner party dynamic where she feels defensive of Gordon, where Joe can choose to go one way or the other, right? Where he might either go the way where he tries to kind of charmingly, fluffily win her over by saying nice things about Gordon, or where he decides to kind of stick the knife in even further, but in a slightly more subtle way. Like you could predict all of those. What you can't predict is Joe having to deal with children. Like the only kind of domestic picture we've had of Joe so far is that his mother is presumably died, or she's AWOL. Like, we don't know. And his father is so unpleasant that he doesn't want to deal with him or talk to him or meet him or have anything to do with him.
Yeah.
And that he may be in competition with him. And there's so much about Joe's background that seems fundamentally broken and dysfunctional. And although that he has this baseball bat that he always has, and it's a very kind of young American boy kind of symbol of childhood almost, you can't imagine Joe as a child. Like, it's really hard to picture Joe not calculating.
All of the stories were from Donna, right? When I was younger, my dad used to take me out into the storm. Like, you can tell that Donna had a
Yeah,
way different upbringing. I mean, we can see that. That's clear as day.
absolutely. And when he strolls into the house with like a 66 Bordeaux and saying
Yeah.
good evening to children, like, who
Yeah,
the
I
hell
love
says
that.
good evening
I
to
know.
children?
And apparently Joe is 35 in the show, which was a great nugget to find out.
I looked it up because I'm a big fan of looking up whether characters really are the age. I think, do you know? I think I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I grew up with like Beverly Hills 90210 and Buffy, shows in which people were clearly 10 to 15 years older than they were supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, Mr. Pace, are you that? And he was about 35 at the time. So he was like at most a year or two out. So actually that was a little moment of like, oh my God, they hired the right person for a change.
Finally, well, this is clearly gearing up for a Lee appreciation moment, which is obviously the scene, that very lightsaber. I'm outside fighting the rain, kind of screaming into the nothing, into the void.
And it's funny you say lightsaber, and that's true. It does feel like a lightsaber moment. But the thing that popped into my head actually was X-Men.
Oh yeah,
there's a bit where it's like that really top down superhero shot, like origin story shot, where you get the rain and the
yes.
light, and the camera is celestial, and it's overhead, and it's looking down over Joe staring up at it. It was actually also reminded me just a little bit of the Shawshank Redemption.
That's
So
okay. I mean, I'll take that. No, but that's 100% true. But also, one of the things that the show does really well from a camera point of view is just really put you in that room, right? So it's gonna put the camera on that table, on that hanger, behind someone, on that shelf, wherever. We never really seen the camera sort of just be hanging in the sky. To me, that was a really cool moment because, and again, you can tell the director had a lot of fun with this. It wasn't just that camera work. It was also the fact that we talked about this maybe in episode 3, where the world on camera sort of slowed down when she was in that hotel party. And I think this was a similar situation where the sound is sort of breaking, obviously because of the hurricane, but you can't really hear Joe, and the score is really ramping up and really creating a tense situation where you don't know if it's like properly dangerous for Joe to be outside, and he's laughing about with the girls watching him, but is he really struggling in that wind, and could something damaging truly come off the back of that? In classic, Joe manner, he's also fighting it, right? To your point about the baseball bat, he is pushing through something that he can't control, basically, right?
there's a huge amount of tension in that scene actually, because even though we then see that the kind of more catastrophic end of things is really happening to Gordon, not to Joe. That Joe's getting the Dorothy Gale treatment, whereas Gordon's waiting for a house to drop on his head. So that we do get to see that actually our tension is paid off somewhere. But yeah, genuinely, the whole time Joe was outside, I was like, is he? I can't remember. Does he get struck by lightning? Because I'm
No,
watching this happen,
almost.
and I'm like, I don't know, this feels like he's teetering on the edge of disaster. And actually, instead, he gets the revelation. He gets to be a child again, but this time without the whatever horrors are lurking in his childhood. And it did occur to me actually much, much later that Cabbage Patch Kids aren't just a sort of time marker. Yeah, they were the craze of the early 80s. I had one. But they're also something you have to adopt. There's something that has a name, has a
Right, yeah.
backstory. You have to parent them. And it feels like the kind of identity wrangling that these guys are going on with is they're having to kind of wrestle with their childhood. So we talked about kind of Cameron recognizing this doll and the impact of this doll and her relationship with her dad, which evidently was positive up until he died.
Yeah.
And then learning to control her inner child in a more adult way. Joe lost sight of his inner child 100 years ago and is just finding it again, and he's finding it in a way through Cameron's kind of youthful uh,
Vision.
vigor and vision, and now through Gordon's kids, who are, you know, the polar opposite of Gordon, who is sort of so locked in his own world. And Donna's having to be the responsible adult. She's the responsible parent. She's been the responsible parent the entire time. She's been the responsible parent to children, to Gordon, to her work colleagues. You know, she is the, you know, the figure of responsibility. And in this episode, she doesn't actually, like, yes, she still has to cook the dinner, but she doesn't have to do as much as she usually does. She sets Gordon a task, which it's anyone's guess whether she thinks he's actually going to be able to achieve it.
Well,
And
she told Joe, like, she
yeah,
told Joe he's probably out there trying to find a Cabbage Patch Kid,
yeah,
even though he told me he had it. Yeah,
yeah.
she knows.
She knows
Yeah.
perfectly well that he, like, she hasn't believed one of Gordon's like white lies for a long time. Um, but she, for once, gets to be charmed, which Joe has not bothered to do with her from the start. Like, their only other interaction, really direct interaction up until now, has been her telling him, calling him on his shit, right? She
Yeah,
calls him on
exposing him.
stuff, exposing him, and being quite contemptuous of him. And even in the very, very first time they meet in the garage all those episodes ago, her only line to him is, "I need to talk to my husband." You know, she dismisses him. And then she exposes him, and he never attempts up until that point. Like, he doesn't even attempt to mollify or charm her, whether it's because he doesn't need her or whether it's because he thinks it won't work with her. Who knows? But this is the first time that he has turned the good side of Joe on her, like, deliberately. And he does it through the kids. And it's these first little flushes or flashes of vulnerability that come through Joe, and they become tangible at the end of the episode where he talks to Cameron and goes, you know, I don't have I don't have an emergency contact. I don't have anyone I could call in an emergency.
The scenes between Joe and Donna really do a lot with not that much. To your point, it's not the whole we're gonna set up a 5 course dinner and we're gonna go through each stage and you can really time things out. One of the really interesting things I noticed was both camera work but also editing is that they they find ways to stitch them together and really in a very conceptual way, which is very much what this episode has brought to the table. They are sitting, I think, opposite each other or near each other, but not directly facing each other.
Yeah.
There's a very rare scene where Donna's actually sort of complimenting Joe. And maybe that's because she's had something to do with the design of the computer, but she's basically telling him that he needs to take a step back and take a helicopter view of what they built, that he is too caught up in the day to day to understand that they've already built a beautiful machine. Now, whether Donna is saying that because she wants to avoid another sort of, who knows what happened to Gordon or between her or them, and she also knows that maybe her marriage is on the line via this project in terms of if Gordon is happy with the project, then we're happy together because this is something fulfilling to him. But what they do with the camera is they set up two very distinctive frames where they are talking to each other, but they are close to each other in terms of where they're positioned in that frame. And what I mean by that is that Donna is sort of facing, she's positioned on the left with a lot of dead space on the right, and Joe is positioned on the right with a lot of dead space on the left. Usually that's the opposite when characters are speaking to each other because it just means that it's a fluid conversation. They're kind of facing each other where they should be if you had a mirror in front of them in a way. So the directors doing that was a really interesting stylistic choice because it is sort of forcing them to be in that room in a way, and it's getting them closer without them having to be physically closer. And what I'm trying to say is sort of underline some of the things that you've unpacked around just these revelations and these characters just allowing themselves to put their guard down for a second and just really put all differences aside for the sake of just having a moment, right? Just having a dinner, just having an intimate moment in bed, whatever that is. And I love that because I just think it added another layer to a scene that could have been very mundane. It could have been also very predictable because we know Donna's dislike or non-approval of whatever Joe does, and Joe not really being impressed by Donna just because he just doesn't fully understand her potential. So to me, that really stood out, and obviously you got to pause and rewind to really catch it. But that's actually the point, that it's just a seamless way of really portraying these two and their I guess new relationship.
Ultimately, I think, again, we never want to talk too far in the future with the show, and certainly, to be honest, I can't always remember the plot anyway.
Oh, me neither.
So-
It's been great to rewatch it.
But the thing that stuck with me with the show, the reason I get so evangelical about it, and we got to this point of wanting to make a podcast about it, is because it makes these choices. It makes these stylistic, often cinematic, continually interesting choices, and it does it in the service of kind of constantly mixing up these characters, constantly putting different pairings together and going, what works or doesn't work, what good things can these two bring out of each other, and what bad things do these two bring out of each other. We've already seen all the bad things that Donna and Joe bring out of each other. It tends to be suspicion and contempt, and now we're seeing a gentleness that actually we haven't really, like, we know Donna is motherly, we know she's maternal, but we haven't seen her being really kind of gentle because she hasn't had the chance. And we haven't seen Joe being gentle because that's the antithesis of everything that he's tried to build so far. And so you're right, making this slightly unusual, slightly unexpected choice brings something out about their relationship without, even before they say a word.
Continuing on with Donna, there was a scene with Hunt at TI where they are discussing. She's getting a bit of praise, isn't she?
Mm-hmm.
She's getting a bit of praise on the work that she's done, and there are a few jokes about whether she's helped with the design of the computer at Cardiff, and
Mm-hmm.
Hunt sort of telling her, "Do you have anything to do with that?" And Donna's got to tell someone, right? I mean, she knows that she knows her stuff.
Yeah.
So there are some really nice shots of Donna just sort of smirking a little bit while he's complimenting her, and I really enjoyed that. But the big setup here is that they are going on a business trip next week.
Mm-hmm. And we're like Donna's mother.
So what do we think?
Well, Donna's mother made sure to, outline that they had a lot of history. And I remember kind of complaining that whole first conversation that she ever has with Hunt is a bit of a kind of, we had history background dump. Like it all happens
Yeah.
in 30 seconds.
We did high school.
You could have gone out with this man, and instead he married a Canadian. And business trip is definitely TV shorthand for affair.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like the show likes to like dangle the obvious in front of you and then take it away. So I don't know what it's going to do with that, but I do feel like there's a big old someone's out there shaking breadcrumbs across the set now.
Oh yeah, for zombies.
So yeah, and speaking of breadcrumbs, I think there's a fascinatingly interesting one in that early boardroom meeting. So just to come away from our four major players for a moment and talk about Bosworth, who we don't see a great deal of in this episode, but he has this moment where when they're introducing the computer, and as you rightly say, you never actually see the computer. It's all about the impact and the relationships in the room, right? It's all about what it's doing to the people in the room. And Lev, of all people, so somebody that we've just barely been introduced to, we're barely beginning to uncover, he's the one that drives the team to say, let Bosworth do it. Let him turn it on. Let him do the big announcement.
Yeah, shut up, Joe.
And it says something really interesting about Cameron's team and their relationship to Joe. So we know Cameron has a relationship with Joe, but her team really are starting to coalesce around her, and they seem to have the same disregard or lack of interest in the showman side of things. They really are only interested in doing something that is exciting, that is interesting, that is engaging, that
above
they
and
are passionate
beyond. I
about.
mean, Jojo built that entire customized adventure, if you want to call it that, for Cameron, where that sparked that
And
idea.
Boz has had this moment where he's called them all in, right? He called them all in and asked them to explain the game to him. And he's taken the time, right? Joe doesn't care who Cameron hires. All he cares about is that Cameron hires the right people and, it is sort of fit to lead that vision. She's proved that she is. Beyond that, he's made no effort to reach out to these people and whereas Boz, we know from previous episode, we know from the kind of dead man's shoes speech that he's had before that he likes to know who people are. He likes to, and he's a salesman, right? His whole shtick is relationships. His whole thing is like getting to know people. When he had to call up, it was like, look at our history, look at all the stuff we've done together. He's like your client services, head of sales, like everything that he does is about bringing people together. And somewhere along the line, it's worked because Lev, who is new and seems quite interested in his own thing, like we haven't yet seen him be particularly chatty or
Yeah, they're
the
all
other.
kind of misfits.
Yeah, they're misfits. And in the scenes where he's introduced, I'd say Yo-Yo comes across as a much stronger character. Like Lev in particular is not one that we've had very much to do with so far. And for him to get that line to go, let Bosworth do it, it's such a clear sign that Joe is losing the heart of the project. And he then goes through this transformation and opens himself up a bit and understands more about what the machine should be and more about what he should be as a person. Like, we don't know if that's going to last, but we know that revelation is happening. And it's such a lovely movement from the beginning of the episode where he's just lost track of the humanity of everything. Everything has become machine and not human. And like he's forced through a kind of becoming a real boy. He's forced through his Pinocchio story to stop being so robotic and start being more human.
Joe's reaction was great when Lev is like, let Bosworth do it. And Joe is like, uh, yeah, yeah, I can be cool. Fine. Like, I'm not, you're not just, you're not hurting my feelings where I'm here giving you the showman speech, but fine, you peasants. I'll let Bosworth do it. Who just says, sometimes you just got to grab life by the balls and jump.
That's just such a wonderfully Bosworth. I mean, it's like when you draw the comparison to
I want
Joe's,
that on a poster.
Like, Joe is all like the thing that gets you to the thing, the vision, the thing. Let me design. Let me ask you a question. Let me open this world. And Boz is like, you grab your balls and jump. He just brings it straight back down to earth, and the fact that this thing is a real thing, is a practical thing, and in an episode that is really like Scoot McNairy does such extraordinary things in this episode, because a lot of the time he is reacting only to himself, only to reflections, only to the weather. He does an incredible job. But you're right, that tiny little reaction from Joe is probably our Lee Pace appreciation moment. Even though he has sort of deeper and more emotional revelations as the episode goes on, I actually think that reaction was one of the classiest little bits of work that he does.
But it's beautiful because it is such a signature Lee Pace thing to do. But the camera stays on him, so we see that flip, right? It's not just like, like off camera sound and then we'll do it. You see him really like settle into that. Mm-hmm. So that's where it really shines. And going back to Cameron's crew for a second, she really seems to have found like a nice set of people. In fact, she seems to be living with them and using a very muscly guy when she gets stuck. That continues to be, I guess, a Cameron thing to do.
Yeah, I'm stuck.
I'm stuck. I'm gonna sleep with this man. Yeah, nice excuse there. I just grab a coffee when I'm stuck, but okay.
She's going into this more sort of, we're used to the origin stories of tech brands being like, they worked out of a garage or they worked here and they worked that. And she's got this interesting dichotomy, Cameron, where she is the visionary, the forward thinker, but she also lives like she's in a 70s commune. She has a sort of like little vintage vibe in the way that she lives. And at some point quite soon, we're going to see that kind of thing resolve itself in the tech world. So when Joe, who up until now has been an IBM man, a traditional showman. He knows what to wear, who to speak to, the different international sort of
Yeah,
ways of
the
dealing with
manual,
things.
it has already been
He's got the
written on
menu, and
that.
he's starting to, like, he's in front of that poster thinking, well, maybe I can take the tie off. Now, we know that around the corner is a Steve Jobs who will choose to spend most of his career in a roll neck and jeans. We know that around the corner is a Mark Zuckerberg who will take to the stage in hoodies and sneakers, and that very soon the classic signifier of a tech CEO is going to be that the most dressed down, schlocky person in the room is the boss. And forgive me if I mentioned this before, I might have done on the show, is that there is even a piece of research, like a piece of academic research that's known as the red sneakers effect, where it talks about how we respond to dressing down, how we respond to kind of casual markers on a person when they're in authority. So that Cameron is now living in this kind of like weird hokey commune with these coder guys, and sort of like drifting into the living room and being like, "You'll do. I'm stuck. You look cute," is a really interesting. But she's also positioned as the kind of visionary thinker. It's a really interesting kind of sowing of the seeds of things to come. And that's one of the things with Cameron where you're just like, like every one of us has done the shared room, the flatmates, like whether at university or after, or whether at first time living away from home or whatever. And you know that you can't live like that forever. You also know that it's like way too expensive to live any other way for a really long time. And even then, before things were the mess they are now, it was going to be difficult. We know that Cameron is getting a decent wage for her age, but also that she's not exactly like she doesn't have anything else. She's clearly quite bowled over by the fact that she's now got money for the first time.
Know what else is out there, right? I mean, not to talk her down, but she finds fun in these guys. She finds a sense of belonging that she didn't have before.
Absolutely. And you want to see more of that. You want to see more of the communal space. You want to understand whether somebody who is as passionate and driven and fixated as she is can carry on sharing space with other people. And if she does, what does that look like? And what kinds of people can she share her space with? Because when she tries to do it with Joe, they brush up against each other and they have friction constantly. Like, they clearly are beginning to really care about each other, but they can't be in the same space. And she looks awkward in his polished, empty, kind of minimalist life. And you cannot for a minute imagine Joe in this ramshackle like commune. So yeah, it's like their home lives, and we haven't really seen very much of Cameron's home life at all, because up until now she's just been in hotel rooms. We know that Gordon and Donna represent the kind of beautiful, yellowy, warm, glowy domestic setup, and we know that Joe lives in an ice cold flat. But now we're beginning to see Cameron's character reflected in her home life. And I think her and her relationship with her team, who are clearly, like we said, they felt like they were going to stick around. It feels like they're going to stick around a little bit longer. Like that something is being, I don't even know if the people writing it know what they're laying tracks for there, but I feel like tracks are being laid.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it just gives Cameron a nice little support group slash kind of army, right? For the battleground that looks to be getting set up at Cardiff Electric, and potentially without Joe even knowing. Now, we've got 4 episodes left in this season. So I am really curious to see where the show is going to take us, right? Whether the technology element, like, does the computer get made? Does it get sabotage? Does it blossom, to play back on that metaphor, I guess, that visual metaphor that we got through Gordon? There's a lot to cover.
Yeah, we've got big questions now. We've got, okay, we know now that Cameron's going to be allowed to build her interface. Is it going to work? Like, up until now, we thought we had a machine that worked, but Gordon is now saying there's going to be massive technological problems with building this graphical user interface. Like, is that going to work at all? If it works, how are people going to respond to it? how are they going to launch this thing? We know that Apple is right around the corner.
Yeah, will they care?
Yeah, we also know that Apple is right around the corner. In this world, in the show's world, are they going to have to go up against Apple? These are all, there's not a lot. It's not even 4 hours. It's 45-minute episodes. So there's like, a scant handful of hours left to answer all these questions, unless they're going to push that into the second season.
Yeah, and we don't know if the writers or the showrunners got the green light for season 2 by now. It's going to be really interesting to see whether there's a proper conclusion to some stuff, whether we find out some things, then to start tying up some loose ends.
Absolutely. And I think that world of not knowing whether you're going to have a second season or not, and you're right, we don't know at what point they got the nod, whether it was after everything was already laid down or whether they knew that before the end. But the end of a first season is always, you've got to tie up enough, but leave enough hanging. And it's like, which bits of this are going to be left hanging?
Oh, yeah, you're going to want to bring people back. I mean, for those that have stuck around for these 10 episodes, this really is the moment to say, we're going to wrap things up, but also give you a glimpse as to why you need more of this. So, yeah, I'm really curious to see where it takes us, and especially on the technology side of it, and how true to life, to your point, it all really does become.
And on the note of the first season wrapping up, I think this is it for us for this week. I think we've covered everything we wanted to say. We will be back with episode 7, which is called Giant. We have gradually been getting in some of our first feedback, which, like, I can't tell you guys how lovely it is to just hear that people are like,
Oh, yeah.
oh, you reminded me to go back and watch the show, or oh, I think you said an interesting thing about that. Like, we're really happy if you come back with, oh, you left out this, or oh, I want to talk about that. Like, that's great too. Like, feel free.
Yeah.
But it totally keeps us motivated. It totally keeps us doing this.
Totally.
It's not a lockdown little project for us. It's something that we've been talking about for quite a long time and really wanted to do properly. So we love you. Thank you. This is great. And it's really making us very happy. So thank you so much. And please come find us on Twitter. We're at TTTGYTTT, so the initials of the show. And we'd love to hear anything you have to say. And to the handful of people who have said they really like my voice, that is very, very sweet. Thank you very much. That's really nice of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of you that have listened to all the episodes so far. It would mean a lot if you would rate us on Apple Podcasts to allow other people to find us a little bit more easily. Even better, subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app of choice. You'll never miss an episode. In the meantime, we'll continue creating quotes and GIFs of our favorite moments to entice all of you into conversation with us. We love your feedback and thank you so much for listening. And we'll catch you on the next one.